Welcome, everybody, to another Masterclass here at Mind for All Seasons. And today we are going to talk about the dynamics of the aging process. We are all aging every single day, and we all know it. But I commonly get asked, well, what's normal and what's not when it comes to aging? So that's basically the topic. And we've all heard the story of spending the first half of life going up the hill, and then the second half of life going down the hill. People kind of jokingly say, well, I guess I'm over the hill. Now, I don't know at what point anybody is quote unquote over the hill. I just know that there's some magical age where you show up at the doctor's office, and if you have a list of complaints, the physician kind of looks at you sideways and says, well, you are getting older. And I think a lot of people don't enjoy hearing that. It's different if you're 25 and you show up at the doctor's office with a list of complaints and they say, oh my goodness, we got to run some tests and figure out what's going on. So I think what a lot of us want as we're getting older is to understand, what can I expect, what is normal, and what's modifiable, and what might be evidence of disease. And we're learning more all the time. So what I'll share with you today is based on our current understanding of what's normal, what's to be expected, what's not really something that we can change versus what is disease, and what actually is modifiable. So along the way, I invite you to think about what your story is. What's going on in your life? What have you observed throughout the course of your life? And what kind of trajectory are you on? Now, the elephant in the room is the fact that the number one cause of death is birth. I often joke about that. We know how the ride of life ends, and that's a sobering thing to contemplate. But the discussion is not about whether we can cheat death. It's more about the aging trajectory. What trajectory are we on? Some people are on a nice line like this purple line that you see on the screen that's kind of a glide slope toward the end of life. And if our ride through life was a flight on a plane, then some people get into their 90s or even above, and they just sort of maintain a lot of their functionality. Their minds are sharp. They're still able to get up and down from a chair and live independently. And it's kind of like they have a nice little touchdown at the end of life. They go to sleep one night and maybe their heart stops, and that's just the end of the ride. Very smooth. Other people have a sharper trajectory. Some people, by the time they're in their 70s, are really having a lot of chronic health problems. These days, especially, more and more people are living for 10, 20, even 30 years with chronic disease, and it's affecting their quality of life. And other people have a trajectory that's kind of like, oh my goodness, the engine's on fire and this flight is going down. And meanwhile, sometimes people are doing the equivalent of passing out snacks and drinks and trying to keep everyone comfortable from the horrible realization that this plane is going down. So an important thing to consider in all of this, that some of you who have been with us here at Mind for All Seasons for a while are familiar with, is the idea that it's very easy to confuse what is common with being normal. And those are two totally different things. So let me give you a few examples. Some of you have seen these, some of you haven't, but we'll quickly go through them. Consider a 1962 high school fitness class, for example. You'll notice some real differences.
A California high school has the well-nigh perfect answer to the president's call for physical fitness. Stan Laprati, physical education director at La Sierra High School, has developed a program that assures every student of physical excellence. Exercise on the grip swing puts muscles on the least athletic. Extension push-ups are among the toughest of the drills. As an incentive to excel, the color of the shorts the boys wear is determined by their ratings on performance charts. Some requirements for top ratings are stricter than for Annapolis plebes. A lad who has mastered the pegboard will find a military obstacle course a snap. 200 schools across the country have adopted La Sierra's program of 15-minute daily competitive exercise. On a hot day, they wet down the wrestling mats for sliding. The boys at La Sierra are learning that it's not only good sense to get toughened up, it's fun.
Well, obviously, things are very different nowadays. Over 75% of Americans are not fit for military service, and standards keep shifting, trying to accommodate people. And things are very different than they were in 1962. And just because things are common now, that it's common that high school kids don't look the way that those 1962 youth look, doesn't mean that it's normal. It means something has changed. Consider what a 1960s day at the beach looked like. We see very different things nowadays, and that should be sobering to us. And that should remind us that something that is not normal is happening. It's common to have metabolic health problems, but that doesn't mean that it's normal. Consider this excerpt from the film Fat Fiction.
U.S. obesity epidemic is only getting worse. Americans are not winning their battle against obesity.
Obesity among children doubled over the past 2 decades.
Today, 75% of the country is overweight or obese, and 1 in 2 of us is either pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic.
Type 2 diabetes is crushing us financially. Crushing us.
It currently costs a person with diabetes in America $900 a month for insulin.
Direct cost to our health care system of about $1 billion a day.
There isn't enough money in the healthcare system to be able to afford this.
The cost in terms of money is huge. The cost in terms of human suffering is 10 times more than that.
In the space of a single generation, we've gone from this to this.
Watching the footage of the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, I was struck by how not fat everyone in the crowd was. We looked like a completely different race of people.
Heart attack.
Now, sometimes it takes comedians and other commentators to have the courage to speak out about something that's deeply uncomfortable. And this is not about shaming anybody. This is just recognizing that we have a significant health challenge metabolically, especially in the United States of America. Things have never been worse. Something has changed. And it's not just metabolism in general that's changed. There are specific disease states that have dramatically increased. Look at the increase of celiac disease since the late 1990s, for example. Or look at autism rates. Autism rates were less than 1 in 10,000 back in the 1970s. And this chart continues to evolve. It's even worse than this now. Autism for boys in the state of California recently came in at 1 in 12. That's not normal. It's common, but it's not normal. ADHD is on the rise, and this is deliberately chosen as a report that was pre-pandemic. Major depression was increasing, and this is also based on insurance data that was prior to the COVID pandemic. So depression is increasing pretty dramatically. Now, all of this begs the question, well, if those things are not normal, if they're just common but not normal, then what does normal aging look like for us as human beings? We're going to consider different organ systems and different aspects of the human body, and I'll talk you through what is normal versus what is disease, and then we'll talk about what is modifiable for each one, and we'll have some discussion at the end of all of this. So let's first talk about the heart, because when the heart goes, we go. Nothing else works. So it is normal that with age we have decreased vaso-motion. If you're not familiar with vaso-motion, it's not just the heart that pumps blood through the body. There's also a expanding and contracting of our vasculature, especially the little microvessels, the capillaries. Think of the cardiovascular system as like a tree, where we have veins and arteries that are like trunks of trees and branches of trees. But about 75% of our blood is off in the leaves. It's in the little capillaries. So if you look at your fingertip, you don't see veins and arteries, but everybody knows if you cut your fingertip, it's going to bleed like crazy. You don't necessarily see veins in your face, but if you cut yourself, the face will often bleed a lot. So there's a lot of blood that's throughout the body in these capillaries, and they expand and contract, but that slows down with age because gravity slows it down over time. There's also a stiffening of blood vessels and arteries. That's called sclerosis. And the loss of estrogen in women after menopause exacerbates that. So if you're reading between the lines, that might suggest, well, okay, if you're a good candidate for hormone replacement, that might be a helpful thing to change the trajectory just a little bit. As we have less flexible blood vessels, then it's harder for blood to flow, which means increased blood pressure. And in addition, our VO2 max declines about 10% per decade, starting around ages 25 to 30. You'll notice that elite athletes are generally not in their 40s and 50s. They might be elite for their age group, but they're not going to compete well with 25-year-old athletes. And that's because of VO2 max, how much oxygen we can pull out of the air and use in our bodies. So you might think of it kind of like our lung capacity. What is disease is different from all those normal things. Having arterial plaques is disease. If you have chronically elevated blood sugar and it damages the endothelial tissue, that's the tissue that the blood is directly in contact with in our vessels, well, that's a disease state. If you have damage to the cardiovascular system because of chronic stress, that's also disease, or chronic high blood pressure, or chronic inflammation. So what things could we do to change the trajectory of our cardiovascular health? Well, one of those things is to manage our glucose levels, and that can be a little bit dependent on your genetics. If you have APOE4 genetics, that's the gene that elevates the risk of Alzheimer's disease, it also elevates the risk of cardiovascular disease. So if you have 1 or 2 copies of APOE4, then a lot of the current researchers focusing in this area suggest that your A1C should be between 4.8 and 5.1 to have optimal results. If you are not an APOE4 carrier, then A1C that's less than 5.6 would be optimal. So like 5.2 to 5.5. It's also modifiable to get 30 to 60 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity 3 times a week, and to spend 30 to 60 seconds doing sprints at maximum effort. There's a tremendous benefit from, let's say you get on an exercise bike and you're pedaling for half an hour at a modest pace. But for the last 30 seconds or maybe the last minute, you crank really hard and you get your heart rate up and you push yourself. Now, that's not something to do if you have a heart condition and your cardiologist says, don't push yourself to that point. You should always check with your doctor before you do something different than you've been doing when it comes to physical activity. And you may need to work up to something like that. But as long as you're able to do it and your doctor doesn't have a problem with you exercising that hard, it's good to get those sprints in. That does a lot for our whole cardiovascular system. Eating an anti-inflammatory diet changes the trajectory with cardiovascular health. And although BMI isn't the very best measure, your body mass index does give a general sense of whether or not you might have a lot of visceral fat around your midsection. BMI can be skewed if you have higher than average muscle mass, because BMI is just calculated by your height and weight. So let's say you're a real athlete, you've got tons of muscle mass, you might have a BMI of 27, and that doesn't mean that you're unhealthy. It just might mean that muscle weighs more than fat and you have a whole lot of muscle. But in general, if your BMI is between 18 and 24, that's a good sign. You want to avoid chronic high blood pressure. And if you're losing weight, then one of the benefits of that is for every 10 pounds you lose, blood pressure tends to drop about 5 points. It's also good to pay attention to an amino acid called homocysteine. And most of you on this webinar have had your homocysteine checked. And as we talk about here at A Mind for All Seasons, if you have your homocysteine level less than 7, that's a really good sign, because elevated homocysteine is a risk factor for both brain health and heart health. And I've listed here on the slide some of the things that affect your homocysteine level. If you have an MTHFR genetic problem where there's a misspelling on that gene, it affects your ability to use B vitamins efficiently. And that's involved in homocysteine recycling. So you might have high homocysteine if you've got a genetic issue with MTHFR. If you have low B12 or low folate levels, that can contribute to it. It's also helpful to maintain an omega-6-3 fatty acid ratio of 4:1 or lower. In fact, if you have low homocysteine, meaning less than 7, and optimal B12 and folate levels and an omega-6-3 ratio of 4:1 or lower, there's some great research from the Oxford University Project to Investigate Memory and Aging, Project Optima, that showed that you will have 73% less brain shrinkage over the course of your life. Talk about changing the trajectory with our health. So what about our muscles and our skeletal system as we age? Well, it's normal and common that our bones will lose density and size as we age, and muscle mass starts to decrease as we age. For most people, that starts around age 30, and there's about 3 to 5% loss of muscle per decade, and that accelerates after age 60. Loss of testosterone can affect that. Women going through menopause have a real shift from storing muscle to storing visceral fat. And I don't think we even know all the reasons exactly why that shift takes place. But it's very noticeable. Any woman that's been through menopause is likely to tell you, wow, all of a sudden I just start to get this little inner tube around the midsection, and it's harder to lose that. Now, what is disease is osteoporosis. And unfortunately, women bear the brunt of the risk for this because the longer women live after menopause, whether it's surgical or natural menopause, unless they're doing hormone replacement, their estrogen levels drop to the point that they start losing bone cells faster than they're being formed. Every bone cell has an estradiol receptor, and when that estrogen level drops off, it's difficult to support the bone cells. So, as you can imagine, hormone replacement might be really helpful for a lot of people when it comes to preventing osteoporosis. There's also the thought that vitamin D deficiency might affect the conversion of protein into muscle. And so there's yet another reason to keep our vitamin D levels optimal. And disease involves preventable muscle loss. So let's consider a 2000 study by Dr. Vonda Wright, who is a longevity expert. And Dr. Wright shared images that I've put here on this slide that are really compelling. The top image is of a 40-year-old triathlete's quadricep muscles. So imagine that you kind of cut a leg off and you can just look at the meat that's right there. What you're seeing is that little white, almost circular spot is the bone. And then around it, there's a lot of muscle in that 40-year-old triathlete. Immediately below it, you get a 74-year-old sedentary man. And all of the white that's around it, you can probably see that with my cursor, all of that is just fat. So there's very little muscle remaining surrounding that bone. This is a 74-year-old who's going to have a really hard time getting up and down from the couch because he just doesn't have a lot of muscle to work with. Now look below it and you see the quadriceps of a 70-year-old triathlete. What's remarkable is that this 70-year-old triathlete has quadriceps that look almost identical to the 40-year-old triathlete. And this study had people recognizing, oh wait, there's common and then there's normal and there's modifiable. And if we stay physically active, we can maintain muscle mass as we age to a much higher degree than people thought possible. So how do we change the trajectory? Well, for starters, we have to eat optimal levels of protein. And one recommendation is 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of optimal body weight. So I weigh 170 pounds. That means I've got to eat between 120 and 170 grams of protein a day to maintain muscle mass as I age. We need to lift heavy weights. There's a typo there. It says life heavy weights. Should be lift heavy weights 3 to 4 times a week. And this is a specific recommendation from Dr. Vonda Wright. She recommends, especially for women, that you do 3 sets of 4 repetitions for major muscle groups. In other words, if you're lifting weight that's heavy enough that you can only do 4 repetitions, let's say you're doing squats and you're squatting down so you're exercising your quadricep muscles. If you can only do 4 before you have to rest because it's just that heavy, and you can do 3 sets of 4 repetitions, then that's the level of weight that she's talking about. Now, if you've never lifted weights or if you've been sedentary for a long time, please do not go out and just start lifting heavy weight like that. Please get yourself a trainer, get permission from your doctor, start lifting lighter, warm up your tissues, do the right kinds of things. In fact, I'd recommend that you come to the Wednesday office hours with Dan and John here on our membership site so that Dan and John from 7 Movements Health can coach you through how to start doing some exercise snacks and start working up to doing more. They're experts in weight training, and they can help you get to the point that you're lifting heavy enough to preserve and build some muscle mass, but it might take some working up too. Dr. Wright says that we should do 3 sets of 8 repetitions for smaller muscle groups, like our biceps, for example. That's a smaller muscle group than our quadriceps. Dr. Wright points out that lifting weights consistently confers a 20-year advantage. So that means by the time you're 90, you're functioning like a 70-year-old. That's a pretty substantial gain. And since, at least at this point, most of us probably won't live past 100, it means that we can maintain our functioning and our independence as we age. There's an interesting study that I put a link to on the slide that showed that the dominant arm of tennis players is about 20% more dense than the non-dominant arm. The bone is denser, it's harder. And the reason for that is when you put a bone under a physical load, when there's weight that's sort of working against it, it drives calcium into the bone and it hardens it. And that very natural experiment of just looking at tennis players knowing, hey, they have a dominant arm and they're swinging it and they're putting it under a load, that fact that they have a 20% more dense arm on their dominant arm tells us something about what happens to all of our bodies when we put them under a physical load and we lift weight. We can also consider optimizing hormones for both men and women because that helps to preserve muscle mass and bone health as we age. What about skin? Skin is our largest organ system. It covers the entire body. It would be miserable if we didn't have skin. We wouldn't survive that. And skin certainly ages. We all get wrinkly skin as we get older. And that formation of wrinkles is pretty normal. Now, some people have an acceleration of that. Some people have a lot more wrinkles because they've spent more time in the sun. There's a lot more oxidative damage, and it shows up as more wrinkles. They might have increased loss of collagen and elastin that makes it harder for the skin to stay taut. It's normal that natural oil production and hormone production diminishes, so the skin gets dry earlier. It's natural that injuries take longer to heal because oxygen doesn't circulate as much as we age. Again, that comes back to our VO2 max dropping. Liver spots start to appear in areas that are exposed to the sun. Now, disease would be things like eczema and skin cancer and pressure ulcers and diabetic-related ulcers and loss of blood flow that's related to vascular damage. Now, regardless of whether we're talking about disease and preventing disease, or even some of the normal things that happen, what's modifiable? Let's look at how to change the trajectory. Well, for one, and you're going to hear this theme over and over, avoid chronically high blood glucose levels. When you have a lot of sugar in the bloodstream, it damages tissues in the body. The more glycation we have in the body, the more sugar that binds to a red blood cell, the less oxygen carrying capacity that red blood cell has. And one of the things that causes diminished oxygen circulation is that if we're eating a chronically high sugar diet and we're kind of shellacking the red blood cell with all that sugar that's binding to it, then it's hard for those cells to carry oxygen. And if you aren't getting oxygen to tissue, it dies faster. Think about what happens if you put a rubber band around your finger really tight and you leave it there. If you left it long enough, your finger would fall off because the skin would die. It would turn black because you wouldn't be able to circulate oxygen to those tissues. So a modifiable factor is to not have so much sugar bound to red blood cells based on what we're eating. Consistent physical activity also improves cardiovascular performance. If you could package up all of the benefits of exercise into a pill, it would be the top seller on the planet because it does more for us in terms of our physical health and our cognitive health than just about anything. We also can optimize our vitamin D levels, our B vitamins, our omega-3 fatty acids. We can prioritize hydration. If you are well hydrated, your skin is going to fare better than if you're chronically dehydrated. Getting modest sun exposure also increases antioxidant production. It increases vitamin D production. The red wavelengths of light and the near infrared wavelengths of light from the sun stimulate collagen production. So get out in the sun. Just don't burn yourself to a crisp because that would be counterproductive to skin health. And maintaining your weight is also helpful, unless you're over the threshold and you're overweight. And I mentioned the red and near-infrared wavelengths from the sun. You can certainly use those intentionally by doing red light therapy, and that stimulates collagen production. That's why you see some of the masks out there for sale where you put it on your face and it stimulates the skin with red and near-infrared light so that you have better collagen production and it makes your skin look younger and more glowing. What about our internal organ systems, specifically the bladder and digestive systems? Well, things do change as we get older. As women's estriol levels drop, then they have an increased tendency for urinary tract infections because the vaginal area gets drier. One of the treatments that I've seen doctors use for years for chronic UTIs is to use an estriol cream. And that's not something that every doctor does as a standard thing, but that intervention has been around for a long time, and it's pretty effective for a lot of people. The bladder becomes less elastic with age. We find that as we get older, our systems just kind of become more flaccid, and our tissues are not quite as taut as when we are little kids or teenagers or young adults. Men commonly have an enlarged prostate, and that can result in difficulty voiding. That doesn't mean that it's a guarantee, but a lot of men go through that. Cells in the stomach also start to not release as much hydrochloric acid and pepsin, and so it can be a little bit harder to digest food. There can be a loss of gallbladder contraction and delayed drug metabolism in the liver. Any doctor that does geriatrics will tell you you have to think about medication differently in an elderly person than in a younger person because they metabolize it differently, and we have to be thoughtful about that. As far as disease, you've got a whole list here between prostate cancer and reflux disease and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and chronic kidney disease and cirrhosis of the liver and bladder cancer and pancreatitis, and the list could go on. There are a lot of different diseases that can affect the bladder and digestive systems and other internal organs. So how do we change the trajectory? Be aware of anticholinergic medications because they cause issues for these systems. And there are a lot of common anticholinergics out there. Benadryl is a common anticholinergic medication. And on top of affecting these systems, it also affects our ability to produce the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is involved in memory. So that's an additional reason to avoid anticholinergics if you can. It's important to optimize fluid intake because our bowels don't work very well and our kidneys don't work very well if we are not well hydrated. Think of the kidneys as like a filter. If I had a cup of dirt and I put a tablespoon of water in that cup of dirt and stirred it around, we would get mud. But if I took that same cup of dirt and I dumped it into a 5-gallon bucket of water, you just get dirty water. If you have a lot of water, then it dilutes everything else. And if you think of the kidneys as like a filter, if we're trying to push mud through the filter, it's completely different than trying to push dirty water through the filter. So hydration matters, and most older adults, and even most regular adults, like 20s to 50s, are chronically dehydrated. We don't drink enough fluid as a general rule, so we can be thoughtful about that. We can avoid unnecessary antibiotic usage. If your white cell count is not elevated, then in general, the infection is viral, not bacterial. So if you're thinking that you might need an antibiotic, you might talk to your doctor about doing a CBC and looking at your blood counts. It might be that this pattern would show up, that your white cells are not elevated, and so you'd realize, okay, this is viral. There's not justification to use an antibiotic. If you absolutely have to use an antibiotic, then follow up with a high-quality probiotic like Megaspore Biotic that can help you get over the hurdle and help to recolonize things with some good bacteria. Avoid unnecessary use of proton pump inhibitors, acid reducers. This is like Prilosec. The stomach needs to be acidic. The thing that causes the sphincter, where the esophagus and the stomach connect, the thing that causes that to close is stomach acid. Sometimes people are getting reflux because they have too low of a level of stomach acid, not because they have too much stomach acid. And yet a lot of people still take acid reducers, and it just exacerbates the problem. We can do Kegel exercises to improve pelvic floor muscles. We can avoid sitting for prolonged periods. At least once an hour, we should be getting up for 1 to 5 minutes and really moving, getting our heart rate up, stretching, getting in different positions, doing some jumping jacks or maybe some push-ups or going up and down stairs or walking around the building a few times. We can eat the rainbow to avoid having a gut microbiome that does not have the diversity of fibers necessary to feed all the different types of bacteria that are there. When we're eating a wide variety of different plant tissues in small quantities, we're feeding all the zoo animals that live in the gut. Avoiding alcohol goes a long way to improving these internal organ systems. We can avoid ultra-processed foods, and we might need to consider digestive enzymes or bile salts, things like betaine HCl, as we get older. If we don't make enough bile or we don't make enough stomach acid, there are supplements that can help and make it easier for us to break down food and get the nutrient value from it. What about vision and hearing? Well, it's normal that as we age, the lens of the eye thickens and it gets a little bit more yellow, and that can change the way that we perceive colors, and it certainly changes the amount of light that we need. By the time we're in our 70s, we need 50% more light to see the same thing that we were able to see in our 20s. I'm 50 and I see that all the time. My kids can look at something and see it just fine, and I can't see it unless I crank up the light. Close vision starts to diminish in our 40s. That's why we hit 40s and we start playing trombone. We hold things out a little bit more. It becomes more difficult to read the label on a medication bottle. That's a pretty normal thing. It happens to almost all of us. We often become more sensitive to glare at night. Our ability to produce tears diminishes. And as far as our hearing, the hearing range tends to diminish with age. And we're especially less sensitive to sounds that are greater than 12 kilohertz. Men experience more hearing loss than women. So sometimes we talk about increased risk of osteoporosis and Alzheimer's disease with women. Well, there's some things for men as well, and hearing loss is one of those things. Now, what about disease? Well, certainly macular degeneration and glaucoma and diabetic retinopathy and cataracts and visual changes that come due to neurodegeneration. If you have posterior cortical atrophy, which looks a lot like Alzheimer's disease, and it ends up progressing much like it in the end, but it starts with deterioration at the back of the brain, the occipital lobe that processes visual images. Well, when that part of the brain is breaking down and brain cells are dying, then it becomes really hard to understand what you're looking at. And often that gets diagnosed incorrectly at first as just a visual acuity issue. It's not. It's actually the brain breaking down and not processing the image the way that it should. Disease could also be deterioration of the auditory cortex. And increased Alzheimer's risk comes when we have hearing loss that's untreated. One of the top things that we can do to prevent Alzheimer's disease is to get hearing aids if we need them. If you are not stimulating the brain with sounds coming in, then the brain atrophies. It doesn't have a reason to keep the whole network online and working the way that it should. So if you're older, if there's any evidence that you might have some hearing loss, like your friends and family are noticing that you're asking them to repeat themselves, or you're asking them to speak up, go get screened and get hearing aids if you need it. It will save your brain. Tinnitus is also evidence of disease, and Randy's talked before that he really feels like tinnitus is just inflammation of the auditory cortex, and that means you have inflammation in your brain. So how do we change the trajectory? Regular screenings, avoid chronically elevated blood glucose levels. There's that common theme about our sugars. Control your blood pressure. You want to water the garden, not pressure wash the garden. We have to get good blood flow to the brain for it to work correctly. But if there's way too much pressure with that blood flow, it's very damaging. Wear ear protection in noisy areas. Wear your eye protection. Maintain optimal nutrient levels. You can even do eye tracking exercises. We've talked before here in Masterclass about the app Infinite Mind that really uses eye tracking exercises to help people improve their reading speed. And there's quite a bit of research on it. It gives documented improvements. Infinite Mind has a free version. There's no reason not to do those eye tracking exercises for 7 minutes a day. And it keeps the muscles of the eye strong and even improves reading while we're at it. We can avoid eye strain with digital devices by taking regular breaks and even wearing blue light blocking glasses so that we're not having that harsh light in our eyes all the time. Metabolically, it's normal that the metabolic rate tends to decrease over time. By age 50, it can drop up to 30%. We've talked before about loss of muscle mass, but that also means loss of metabolism. The more muscle we have, the more we can really crank up things metabolically, and we can burn more fuel. Hormonal changes can affect metabolism, and over time, the pancreas just produces less insulin. As far as disease, too much insulin in the blood, hyperinsulinemia, is a problem. That's what leads to type 2 diabetes. We can have metabolic disruption from endocrine disruptors and other toxic chemicals. There are thousands of chemicals in our world today that mirror or have a similar effect as hormones do in the body. And that goofs up our whole endocrine system. So avoiding those toxic exposures can go a long way toward helping our bodies as we age. Disease can also show up as things like polycystic ovarian syndrome or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Of course, heart disease and atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's and mental health disorders are all evidence of a disease state that involves metabolism and very likely changes in insulin. So how do we change the trajectory? Eat real food, not processed food. I should clarify that. Let's say that you take some natural ingredients that you get from the produce section and you cut them up and you cook them. You just process them. That's processed food. Ultra-processed food is more all the fibers removed, and it's where we take natural ingredients and then we modify them many times over to the point that they don't look like anything that you find in nature. You open a box of something that can sit on the shelf for months on end, and you pull out something that is not like anything that you see in the natural world. That's more what we're talking about when I say avoid processed foods. We can prioritize protein and healthy fats. We can check fasting insulin levels and make sure they're not creeping up. Optimally, they should be less than 7. We've talked before about A1C and how to manage that if you're an ApoE4 carrier versus if you're not. You might consider using a continuous glucose monitor once or twice a year and just seeing how your body's reacting in real time to what you're eating. If it's safe to do it, periodic fasting can hit the metabolic reset switch. Having at least 12 hours from our evening meal till when we eat again the next day, so like 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., having that as a minimum gives our bodies time to process and rest and to do other functions that only happen when we're in a fasted state. Strength training to maintain muscle mass improves metabolism, and improving hormonal levels as we age can be a very helpful thing in all of this. What about Physical intimacy. What about sexual relationships? That's an important part of who we are as human beings. It's normal that desire for intimacy remains throughout life. But it's also normal that sexual response times tend to slow down after about age 50. It's normal and very common that women who are postmenopausal might have more vaginal dryness because of the loss of estriol and estradiol. There's some vaginal atrophy. And you could do something about that by talking to your doctor and considering hormone replacement. Diminished blood flow can affect both men and women in terms of their ability to climax when it comes to sexual behavior. And so things that improve cardiovascular health also improve sexual health. Evidence of disease is erectile dysfunction. Often that comes because you've got chronically elevated sugars that lead to poor cardiovascular health, and we're not circulating blood very well, and that drives erectile dysfunction. And if you're not getting good blood flow downstairs, you're probably not getting good blood flow upstairs to the brain either. Depression and other mental health challenges that tie in with a lot of these things that we're talking about can also affect sexuality as we age. And certainly things labeled as sexual dysfunction are things that might warrant working with a qualified provider that can help you through some of those issues. Ways to change the trajectory would be regular physical activity. Cardiovascular exercise goes a long way toward helping in some of these things. Avoiding chronically elevated blood glucose and avoiding ultra-processed food can be helpful. Working to maintain both emotional and physical intimacy can go a long way. Sometimes just spending more time together and enjoying each other on a lot of different levels, intellectually and socially, leads to improvement in physical intimacy as well. I've listed tadalafil and sildenafil. Those are medications that were developed for cardiovascular health, but the side effect that was noticed in the studies was especially noted by the men who said that they didn't have such problems with erectile dysfunction when they used those medications. Now, there's been research that shows that using those types of medications, even in women, reduces Alzheimer's risk or can be helpful to them because it improves blood flow throughout the body, including to the brain. So if you're struggling with anything related to sexuality and aging, don't hesitate to talk to your doctor about it. It's an important part of life and not something to just brush under the rug. So we'll kind of wrap up here with brain health. And I won't spend as much time here because we talk about brain health a lot here at A Mind for All Seasons. It's normal, though, that learning requires a more deliberate focus after age 30. It takes from birth to our early 30s for the brain to finish being fully developed. And after that, we're no longer in sponge mode. After that, things do slow down just a little bit, and we kind of settle into the adult brain. Processing speed over time can slow down a bit. And part of that is just because we learn so many more things and we're dealing with so many more things and our vocabularies grow, that there's more to sort through. That's at least one of the theories for why processing speed slows a little bit. Dramatic slowing of processing speed is likely more problematic, more evidence of disease. It's normal to occasionally forget where you placed something. That commonly happens when we're distracted. It's normal to walk into a room and forget why you're there. That happens because we went through a doorway and our brain perceives a different context. If you can go back to where you were when you had the original thought and it comes back to you, or if you can retrace your steps when you forget something and it all comes back, it's totally normal. Now, if you're constantly forgetting where you are, what you're supposed to be doing, you can't retrace your steps and things are getting worse, that's more evidence of disease. It's normal to have increased difficulty managing multiple tasks. None of us is really good at multitasking anyway. What we're doing is cognitively switching rapidly. And it's normal that that ability to switch back and forth quickly does diminish a little bit as we age. There's often slight brain shrinkage as we age. And we may occasionally struggle to find a word for a lot of different reasons. It might be that we have such a robust vocabulary that the brain is kind of sifting through a lot of things trying to figure out what the right word is. What's evidence of disease, though, is progressive memory loss that just gets worse and worse over time. Things like I've talked to people who have loved ones saying, wow, mom is going to the bank 5 times in the same day. And we finally had a call from the bank saying, did you know that your mother has been here 5 times and she's withdrawn $500 every single time? And when we say, you were here an hour ago, she says, no, I wasn't. What are you talking about? Give me my money. That is evidence of disease. If a person has diminished reasoning and judgment and planning and insight, there's something going on with the frontal lobe of their brain. When there are changes in mood and personality and behavior, especially dramatic changes, that's evidence that there's disease going on. When someone has cognitive or mental health diagnoses, evidence of disease. Changes in orientation to person or place or time. If someone doesn't know where they are and what's going on, and they can't track the flow of time, that's evidence of disease. When people struggle to even put sentences together, again, that's real evidence that there's a problem. So how do we change all of that? Well, there's a lot that you can do. And we've talked about a lot of these things. These are things that are part of the enhanced protocol here at A Mind for All Seasons. And we're not only confident that we can change the trajectory, but what sounds crazy to some people is the idea that we can often improve the trajectory, especially when it comes to our cognitive and mental health. We see it all the time as we address some of these root cause factors. We see it in people like 62-year-old man with a diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease that was confirmed by 3 different neurologists. And they all said, I'm sorry, there's not much we can do for you. Well, his composite memory score in a matter of a few months, from July to December, went from the 8th percentile to the 91st percentile, with all of his other scores dramatically shifting up as well, all by just dealing with the modifiable things that we know about. Now, in the end, I want you to hear just a few minutes of a video that we created quite a few years ago now. These kids have all largely grown up, but this is a view from children about why it matters to protect our brain health and, by extension, our physical health. We can do different things if we are thoughtful and proactive in our approach. So I'll let the kids do the talking as we wrap up here.
If you protect your brain. If you protect your brain, you can dance with me at my wedding. You can come to my graduation. You can watch me become a doctor. You can watch me become a scientist. You can watch me be an airplane flyer. If you protect your brain, you won't get confused like your mom did. You can teach me how to take care of my first dog. You'll remember the time we went to Sun Valley. If you protect your brain, if you protect your brain, if you protect your brain, you can be there when I need you. You will remember who I am. You can teach me how to be a good dad. Please protect your brain.
All right. So there's so much that we can do to take care of our cognitive and mental health and our physical health as we age. And if we do it, we can be there for the people who are counting on us, especially the next generation. And I hope that's motivation for all of us to do everything that we can to change the trajectory in ways that are truly modifiable. So let's take a few minutes. We had a little bit of a late start today due to some technical glitches, but let's take a few minutes here and answer any questions or share any thoughts that you had as you listen to the material today.